Hey guys, Mr. Moore here. Welcome to our first foray into remote virtual learning video lecture. I don't know exactly what all we're calling this, um, but I'm going to walk you through this PowerPoint. This is already on Google Classroom, which will become important as you'll see later on, but I'm going to walk you through it so that you can get a little bit better sense of what's going on here. I think we mentioned that the reason that I put the question for the fideist group presenting those apologetic topics, the reason I put that question last is because it segues us into our next unit, which is Christianity among other faiths. So I want to start sort of big picture about these ideas of religious pluralism and ultimate reality. There's a person that we're going to talk about in a second that this is how he sort of frames the debate, which I think will be helpful for us to see as well. So yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, and because it was St. Patrick's Day, I decided to start with a poem from a wonderful Irish author. His name was William Butler Yeats, Irish poet. He says, "Though leaves are many, the root is one. Though all the lying days of my youth I swayed my leaves and flowers in the sun, now I may wither into the truth." We've got this nice picture over here of the leaves. So what Yeats is getting at there, I think, is this idea that eventually, though there's many, many leaves and many branches and outpourings and everything else, the trunk is the same. So it's this idea, sort of like we were getting at in that apologetic group in that last question. Is every religion the same? Does every religion lead you to God? Is there any teeth to Christianity's claim of exclusivity? That is, if Christianity claims to be the one true religion, how true is that? Is there any backing there? And how would you know? How would you know whether this is true or not? And I think that's sort of what Yeats is getting at here, is this sort of idea that eventually with time and with wisdom and everything else, we just sort of get back to the trunk, which is this ultimate reality sense. More on that in just a second as well. So the idea of religious pluralism has to do with a few things, okay? More pictures of trees and trunks here. First of all, pluralism, as you can probably deduce, there's not just one. There are plural, okay? You'll hear people talk about we live in a pluralistic society, meaning that there's all kinds of values and value systems and beliefs and worldviews and everything else, and I think that you're aware of that. And if there is religious pluralism, what religious pluralism is going to try to say is that religions are all subject to a few things. They are subject to respect, to freedom, and to equality. Okay, so respect, obvious, makes sense. You don't demean people for their faiths. You don't, I don't know, you're not bigoted towards people because of their religion or their faith or anything like that. Freedom, which makes a lot of sense to us in the West, to us as people in the United States. People should have the freedom to express and to worship however they see fit according to their religions and to their faiths. Equality gets a little bit trickier. Okay, so equality in one sense, in a sort of secular government sense, is obvious and it makes sense to us. Okay, people should be treated equally. Yeah, okay. But does equality also mean that every religion is equally valid? Okay, this is the question that we're going to deal with. Is religious pluralism, does it hold up in saying that every religion is the same, that every religion is equally right or maybe equally wrong? That's what we're going to talk about. So, all right. So the guy that I had mentioned earlier, the philosopher who's talking about ultimate reality and pluralism and everything else, his name is John Hick. Okay, so a philosopher named John Hick. He writes this essay about religious pluralism and ultimate reality that we're going to look at to try to figure out exactly what these terms mean, what people mean by them. Okay, like I said, you're going to hear about this idea of pluralism a lot in our day and age. Okay, so Hick writes this essay, and we're going to put this over here for right now. And there is this essay. Well, somebody has helpfully boiled this essay down. Okay, So you can see it's pretty long. This is just sort of the outline version of it. We're going to walk through this outline together so that you don't have to read the whole thing. It's pretty long, but it's pretty clear. It makes sense. But somebody has I don't know what this school is, Hettinger and people of CFC. Somebody has kind of done this work for us. Okay. So in the introduction, okay, Hicks says God has historically revealed. Whoops, this will become important. Him or herself through various individuals in different times and places. Okay, so in this subpoint I, this will be important. Geographic insulation prevented a common revelation to all humanity. Okay, so Hick at the outset, he's not saying that God doesn't exist. He's not saying that religions are false. He's just saying that because of geographic insulation, because of how the world was, say 3,000 years ago, God could not, whatever God is, he or she could not have revealed himself to everybody all at once. Maybe today that makes sense because we could all just FaceTime each other and talk about this crazy. It's the tweet that I think I told you about the guy who was like, what if God just yelled period from the sky right now and scared all of us? That would be a common revelation to all humanity, and we could all talk about it. But people were insulated geographically 3,000 years ago, so this wasn't a thing. Okay? But each major religion has a different interpretation of the same, here's your term, ultimate reality of the same salvation. Interesting. Other religious peoples participate in ultimate reality as validly, here's your idea about equality, as we do within our religion. Now, who's we, who is our, it's probably just some sort of non-partial, objective stance, right? He's not talking about anybody specific. Hick defines religion, okay, as an understanding of the universe with an appropriate way of living within it, okay? This is what we would call ethics. With a reference beyond the natural world to God, gods, the absolute, you boy, SK, or a transcendent order or process, all right? The definition applies to both theistic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism, of the Bhagavad Gita, Mahayana Buddhism. We talked a lot about theism in classical apologetics. It also applies to non-theistic faiths, okay? Theravada Buddhism, non-theistic Hinduism. Because there's a belief in an ultimate reality or a state of enlightenment. Again, there's some sort of transcendence involved here. The definition does not apply, however, to purely naturalistic systems of belief like communism or humanism, okay, though these would count as some sort of form of ethics, which are, okay, he's saying they are immensely important alternatives to religious life, okay? People can just choose to be ethical people. They can choose to be good people. We've had this conversation. Now, whoever's editing this from Hettinger or whatever asks, what about paganism, earth worship, environmentalism? Okay, Hick doesn't really go into that, at least not here. Okay, we'll see if he delves into it a little bit later. With this idea about revelation and common humanity and everything else. Religion historically developed. Why won't you let me scroll? Religion historically developed this way, all right? It's virtually universal. Okay, this is your Chris Hitchens, your David Foster Wallace talking about humanity as worshipful, right? We have this innate desire to worship, all right? The way this worked at the start was in something or some way called animism or pantheism, all right? You just think that God is everywhere. The primitive spirit worship expressed man's fears of unknown forces, right? If you don't know where rain and wind and all that heat and everything else is coming from, you don't know why crops grow sometimes and why they don't grow other times, then you'll just try to appease whatever god it is or whatever force it is that you think causes this. All right, his reverence for natural deities expressed his sense of dependence upon realities greater than himself. And eventually this will become an ultimate reality that is greater than himself. Until about 800 BC, interesting time, man had religion without revelation. And if we're thinking in purely biblical terms, what I've taught you, if you think back to our timeline, yay, the timeline. If you think back to that, Who's coming around about 800 BC? It's the Hebrew prophets. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible start coming around 800 BC. Okay, so these are the pre-exilic prophets. If you think back to that, Hosea, Micah, people like that, Isaiah to some extent. Okay, then for the next 500 years, there's this golden age of religious creativity. Okay, so there's the Hebrew prophets. There's also a lot of other people in the ancient Near East who are, okay, he talks about this down here. If you'll skip down a little bit. There's other people in the ancient Near East who are claiming to have the same sort of prophetic understanding. All right, there are revelatory experience in different parts of the world. Remember, we talked about geographic insulation. Religious faith attributes this to the pressure of the divine spirit upon the human spirit. Okay, so he mentions directly here. There's Isaiah. There's Lao Tzu, the father of Taoism and Confucius in China. The Upanishads written in India. The Gautama, the Buddha lived. The Bhagavad Gita is written. This is the Hindu holy text. Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato are in Greece. And though they are doing philosophy, we've talked a lot about their philosophy, and it very much has to do with these spiritual ideas. Okay? Then there's a 300-year gap, and Jesus of Nazareth comes out of Galilee, preaching about the kingdom of God, and we get the emergence of Christianity. We get another gap, and then Muhammad comes along, and we get Islam. Hicks says all of these are moments of divine revelation. God really does reveal himself or herself or itself or whatever to all of these people, to all of these people groups. This really is real revelation that is transforming the world. All right, so that is Hicks sort of giving his historical perspective on these things. Like, how did this develop? Now we're going to move into his more normative claims. Okay, so what is the truth claim that's actually happening here? Okay, well, it's that the world religions are not really inconsistent. That ultimately, sorry, my stylus is on the wrong color. That they're not inconsistent. Ultimately, the great revealed faiths, okay, we're going to return to that idea. Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism are not essentially rivals. Okay? He considers this objection, and he says, yes, theologically, they conflict as they have different truth claims, right? Is the divine nature personal or non-personal? Does the deity become incarnate in the world, right? Keyword for Christians, but also for Hindus. I think I told you before. Ours is not the idea that God is Zeus, though. He doesn't come down as an eagle, right? He comes down himself as a human, okay? He doesn't just change forms, as Stephen Furtick would have you believe. Are humans born again and again on the earth? Okay, so this is, yes, the Hindu idea of reincarnation, but I think he's also thinking about John chapter 3 here, where Nicodemus comes and asks Jesus, right, how do I enter the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, no one can unless they're born again, all right? Hicks says, there you go. Those are the same thing, right? They're talking about reincarnation in some sense, okay? So he says, though you might think that if what one religion says on these topics is largely true, some other religions will be largely false. He says, no, that's not actually true, because the nature of divine reality is so big and so transcendent and so incomprehensible that it transcends the grasp of the human mind. Not a thing or part of the universe existing alongside other things. God cannot be defined or encompassed by human thought. We can't draw boundaries around his nature and say that he is this and no more. The God we think about is merely a finite and partial image of God, okay? And we've talked a lot about how transcendent and how big God is. I don't want you to think that we are agreeing with John Hick here, though. Hick says, yeah, so everybody's talking about how big and transcendent God is. So each encounter with the divine is true. Everybody's getting some aspect of God. Everybody's got some sort of understanding here, all right? It seems like they conflict, but it's just because we don't have a big enough picture of the divine reality, of what he's going to call the ultimate reality. All right? It's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth, okay? And we'll pull this up again. Sorry, once I start writing on it, I don't know how to scroll. But we'll move down a little bit. And Hicks says, let's see if I can find it. He's not even making the claim that every religion is equally true, okay? He thinks that some religions are truer than others, as it were, There we go. Right? They're primitive forms of religion that are probably less equally valid than these others. But every conception of the divine coming out of the major religious traditions represents a genuine encounter with reality. Well, John Hick, how do you know that? He says, well, it's sort of a threefold test, right? One, they have to have this great revelatory religious experience. Okay? Generally, what this leads to is the writing of a holy text. Okay? Whether it's the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, what have you. It has to be tested through a long tradition of worship, and it has to have sustained human faith over centuries and millions of lives. So if there's some great new revelatory experience that someone has tomorrow in, say, Egypt or somewhere like that, hey man, that might be true, but we won't know about it until it's been sustained over centuries and changed millions of lives. So we would really have no way of knowing, okay? Hick brings up, I mentioned this to one of the groups that was presenting, this idea, the parable of the blind man and the elephant. All right, Hick brings it up basically to distance himself from it, okay? Most people are saying that they're all stupid, all the blind men. They don't actually have any idea what they're talking about. Hick's trying to say, no, they're all true. All of these are true, and in some sense, they are equally true, right? If you're not familiar with the parable, so one blind man, these 3 to 5, however many you want, these blind men walk up to an elephant, and they start touching the elephant. And they each think that what they're touching is a different thing. Okay, so one blind man touches the leg and says, wow, this is some sort of living column, this pillar. Okay, it's like concrete, it's huge, but it's moving, and it's got like leathery casing or something. Okay, another blind man touches the trunk, says, wow, this is just like a snake, this massive snake. Okay, and another one touches the tusk and says, this is farming equipment, this is a plowshare. They're all true. They're all claiming something that is true, okay? But ultimately, we're not getting the full picture of this reality, all right? This last bit down here, we won't even have to pull it up. It's just sort of where Hick thinks religion goes from here, that if we realize that all religions are true, that ultimately we get to this point and we say, like, oh, I guess we should just start mixing them then. We should just start mixing faiths. So we'll have, like, Christian Buddhists and Hindu Muslims and things like that. That these faiths will just become like intertwined, and they'll all start sort of embracing a fuller and fuller picture. And Hick sees this as a good thing. He thinks that this is ultimately going to get us closer to this ultimate reality. All right, so just to sort of sum this up, all right, what Hick means when he talks about ultimate reality. He says that this is the transformation of human existence from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. Okay? You move out of thinking just about yourself and thinking that you're the point of everything, and you start to realize that there's a greater reality than just you. All right? Hick says that every religion is essentially the same because it gets us to this point. Now, I think you can probably stop for the day if you've gotten through all this. Once we get through this slide. But I want to just quickly, we're going to deal with responding to Hick later, but just for the record right here, if all this religious experience if all it does for us is move us from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness, it gets us outside of ourselves. It introduces us to a world greater than ourselves. That can happen by all kinds of things. You don't need some sort of revelatory experience from God in order to get this. In fact, most people my age, at least for me, I think this would apply to a lot of people my age, most people my age actually have a moment where this happened to us, where we all together got moved from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. And it was September 11th, 2001, where we realized that, oh, the world is much bigger than just my world. Okay, I was in 3rd grade when this happened. I may have told you before about the quote of debated validity from either Dostoevsky or George Bernard Shaw. He says that the hardest thing for most people to realize is that there are other people. All right? The hardest thing for most people to realize is that there are other people. All right? Some of you, hopefully, despite the fact that you are isolated and distancing yourself socially, some of you are realizing through this stuff that we're going through that there are other people, and they're affected by this. So we would ask John Hick, can my religion be September 11th, 2001? Can it be this revelatory experience of the coronavirus? I suspect he'd say no. So he's got a problem here. And like I said, if you want to cut short to, the PowerPoint, if you want to end this today, it's probably a good stopping point. But I'm going to move on, so you can go with me if you'd like. Now, this is the reason that it's important that the video or the PowerPoint is already on Google Classroom, because my little app here won't actually let me play this video. So I need you to go to Google Classroom and watch this video. It's about 15 minutes long, okay? And it's going to introduce you further to this idea that basically every religion and every sort of meaning-making story is the same. I think this is pretty cool. It'll help the way that you watch movies and read books and things like that. And then once you're done watching that video and watching this video of the PowerPoint and everything else, then you'll be ready to answer our question that I'm posing on Google Classroom. That's also on the last slide that's also on the last slide here. Sorry, I forgot that it changes the volume there. Are all religions the same? Is Christianity just another one of many stories that follows the same trajectory? Sorry. Didn't realize that was there. Those are two very large questions. I know one group just prepared all this. Are all religions the same? Is Christianity just one of many other stories that follows the same trajectory? And I will actually add on to this so that you can have a little bit more to think about and write about if you just cannot, under any circumstances, write 250 words. The horror, I know. All right, guys, so that's it for at least the next couple of days. So get your responses to these questions and whatever else I ask you on the Google Classroom forum. Get these responses in by Friday at midnight, and then respond to 2 of your classmates by Tuesday at midnight. All right, thanks.